Hello everybody, this is Kenneth of My Three Ducks Productions. Thanks for stopping by. One of the things I like to do when I get the time is creative writing. I've actually written a couple of novels, and if you can believe it, several hundred short stories. I'd like to share one of those short stories with you now, a quirky little piece, just in time for the holidays. I hope you like it. Oh, Little Town. Finally, it had come. The front worked its way down out of the mountains and rolled on towards Denver. The same layer of gray clouds that had decapitated the mountaintops quickly worked its way eastward. One moment Jimmy could see the distant upward roll of the land that eventually became the Rocky Mountains. In the next moment that distant slope was gone. As he stood waiting for the barista to pour his coffee, he cast another glance into the corner to where the good-looking woman in the short skirt sat. She had flaming red hair and lipstick to match. She caught his look and frowned. He looked back out the window. The clouds had now stolen the edge of town. It had become unknown again, like the unexplored regions on old maps. Here there'd be monsters was true again. Now the not-too-distant frost-yellowed treetops began to fade. In the next moment, they too were gone. A few drops of rain began to fall. Just enough to make him wonder if maybe he'd gotten his hopes up. Maybe it wouldn't come at all. Maybe the clouds that rolled across the landscape like poison gas on a World War I battlefield would capitulate and allow the rude sunshine a foothold. It would then push the clouds away and allow the azure blue sky to come rushing back, like air into a vacuum. But like an advance guard, the first few drops notified the main waiting force. The few impotent pitters now became impressive patters. Puddles quickly formed, their gray waters pockmarked with pelting drops. It was becoming a real rain. Things were looking up. Just in time for the holidays, the paper Starbucks cup set on the counter in front of him was a bright, festive red. White printed stars shone here and there upon it. One of the stars was quite large. A ray of its light traveled down from the top of the cup to where it disappeared beneath the paper guard put on to protect him from the hot coffee inside. Jimmy picked up the cup, held it aloft, and closely examined its bottom. There were 3 baristas behind the counter. The only other people in line besides Jimmy were a woman and a small boy. All the baristas stopped what they were doing and looked when Jimmy raised his cup. Then they looked at each other. One barista shrugged, another shook his head, but the barista who'd waited on Jimmy had to ask. "Something wrong with it?" he said. "No," Jimmy said, setting the cup back down. "I was just looking for something." "Like a prize or what?" the barista said flippantly. He had a lot of tattoos up and down his arms. A hodgepodge of things all blended together, seemingly without design. In one spot, Jimmy noticed a Taoist yin and yang symbol. Below that, a nude woman stood, showing off all the gifts nature had bestowed upon her. And below her, as if she intended to step on it, a small duck. The young barista also had pegs in his earlobes, like lots of people these days. Over time, they inserted larger and larger pegs in order to stretch the earlobes out. Until recently, the only other place Jimmy had ever seen such a thing was in a certain African tribe in a National Geographic magazine. Now, a Starbucks barista in Denver, Colorado, had found it fashionable. Something about it made Jimmy feel that the world was careening headlong into an abyss, but he didn't share his opinion with the barista. "No," Jimmy said, "I just figured if there was a big star printed on the side of my cup, that maybe the baby Jesus was printed on the bottom." He thought it was funny, so he chuckled. The young barista just looked at him. He seemed not to have gotten the joke. Jimmy turned to see if the woman in line in back of him had gotten it. She was frowning. She hadn't gotten it either. Either that or the mention of Jesus had in some way offended her. That was the problem with people these days. They were just too damn politically sensitive. All the best jokes were offensive in some manner. But the little boy was smiling. He'd gotten it. "Pretty funny, huh?" Jimmy said to the boy. "Yep," the boy said, matter-of-factly. After he'd found a table and sat down, Jimmy slid the protective paper sleeve from his cup and looked beneath it. He thought he might find the little town of Bethlehem there. 3 wise guys on camels, sand dunes, a palm tree or two. But the only thing he found was a big Starbucks logo. The woman in the corner was eyeing him suspiciously. She was probably wondering why he hadn't looked at her in a few minutes. She didn't want him to look, except when he wasn't looking. So Jimmy looked. He noticed for the first time that she also had red fingernails. He liked that. It was kinky in a way. She frowned when she saw him looking. You couldn't win with women. By this time, the small boy and his mom had gotten their drinks. They sat down at a table nearby. As soon as she was seated, Mom took her smartphone out and began texting away. But the little boy kept looking in Jimmy's direction. He'd slid the paper sleeve from his own cup, just as Jimmy had done. He looked back and forth at his cup, and then at Jimmy.
"No wise men,"
the boy whispered, so faintly that Jimmy wasn't sure he'd actually heard it, or had only read the boy's lips. Jimmy nodded. It was true. There were no wise men. The little boy continued to examine his cup. He turned it round and round on the table. Mom continued to text.
"No camels,"
the little boy said now in the same almost inaudible whisper. Again Jimmy nodded.
"And no donkey,"
the little boy whispered. Jimmy couldn't help but laugh. Picking up his cup, he began turning it around and around in his hand.
"Maybe it's a snowflake and not a star,"
Jimmy whispered back. The little boy scratched his head for a few moments. Holding his cup in front of him, he pointed at the big object printed on the side and shook his head. When he did, his little blonde bangs swished to and fro.
"No, it's the Star of Batman."
Jimmy leaned out of his seat in the direction of the little boy. Surely he hadn't heard the boy correctly.
"Did you say Star of Batman?"
Jimmy whispered back. The little boy nodded.
"You mean like Batman and ramen?"
Jimmy whispered. The little boy cocked his head to the side and slowly raised his eyebrows. Obviously it was a no-duh gesture. Jimmy laughed again. Leave it to a kid to come up with something so outlandish. He was just about to whisper something else to the boy when he suddenly noticed that Mom was no longer texting. She had a frown on her face. "Something wrong?" she said to Jimmy.
"No,"
Jimmy whispered. Then he caught himself. He cleared his throat and began speaking in a regular tone. "No," he repeated. "I was just chatting with your boy." "About what?" the woman said. She was wearing red lipstick too, but not as red as the woman's in the corner. Jimmy glanced at the other woman. She frowned. Again. "The Star of Batman!" the little boy interjected excitedly. "The what?" Mom said, looking at the boy. "Star of Batman," Jimmy said, pointing out the object on his cup for the woman. Seeing Jimmy do it, the little boy began pointing out the same object on his own cup. "Right here, Mom." "Mister," the woman said, ignoring the boy, "I don't know what kind of nonsense you're filling my son's head with, but I don't appreciate it." "Me?" Jimmy protested. "He's the one filling my head full of stuff." "Oh," the woman said, shaking her head. "He's just a child." She began collecting their things from the table. "Come on, Billy," she said, standing up from her chair. She took the little boy by the hand and ushered him towards the door. In a flash, they were gone, leaving both their drinks still on the table. Getting up from his chair, Jimmy got the 2 drinks and brought them back to his own table. All 3 baristas looked at him. Then they looked at each other. All 3 shrugged this time. The woman in the corner had a look on her face like you'd see in a horror movie. She stood up and also beat a hasty retreat out the door. Jimmy couldn't help feeling a twinge of sadness seeing her go. She had a nice, shapely ass beneath that red dress of hers. She also took her drink with her. Mom's drink turned out to be some kind of foo-foo latte. Too many squirts of cloyingly sweet syrup and too little coffee. It tasted like something you'd find in an Aunt Jemima bottle. Jimmy drank it anyway. Mom hadn't touched it the entire time she'd been there. She'd been too busy texting. She'd also been wearing red lipstick. One thing about red lipstick was that a woman couldn't put anything to her lips without leaving behind a red smear. Jimmy's mother had worn red lipstick too. He thought of her now. When they'd been in the car when he was a kid, his mother had lit his dad's cigarettes for him, as his dad always drove. His dad was capable of lighting his own. Jimmy had seen him do it many times. He also carried a Zippo in his pocket, but in the car he used the dashboard lighter. Jimmy remembered the way it clicked when it was pushed in, and then clicked back out when it got hot. His father drank a lot of beer too while he drove. He said he drove better after a few beers. It relaxed him. Jimmy's mother never offered to open those. Sometimes, after his dad had had a few, he'd run off onto the shoulder of the road. That always scared the shit out of Jimmy. To this day, he couldn't hear the sound of crunching gravel without thinking he was about to die. Regardless, there was always a smear of red on the butt of the cigarettes his mom lit. After he drunk the mom's drink, Jimmy began on the kids'. It turned out to be hot chocolate, or cold chocolate now. He ended up mixing his own coffee in with it to make it more palatable. All the while the barista stared. The one who'd turned his body into an ink-covered canvas kept scratching his head. Quite possibly he had tattoos there too, hidden beneath the hair, like some private gallery. Maybe there was another Mona Lisa there, waiting to be rediscovered after the barista went bald one day. The rain was much heavier now. It drummed pensively on the front window, like nervous fingertips on a desk. Night was coming on. The streetlight sheen on the wet tree branches made them look like they were covered in thin layers of ice. If the temperatures continued to drop, that might become a reality by morning. All of Jimmy's drinks were gone now. He brought his cup back up to the counter and set it down. He was now the only customer in the place. "Can I help you?" the well-inked barista said, as if he'd only just then been magically transported into the cafe and hadn't yet figured out why he was clad in a Starbucks apron. It was near closing now. The barista made no attempt to hide his disdain for anyone keeping him from his dingy apartment and sticky, fingerprint-covered Xbox. "My cup is defective," Jimmy said facetiously. "Oh yeah?" the barista said in a disinterested tone. "How so?" "It's empty." The two of them looked at each other for a few moments. Suddenly the barista seemed to get it. It was a joke, but he didn't laugh. "Oh," he said, reaching for the cup as if it were a dead rat. He refilled the cup and set it back on the counter. "On the house," he said without smiling. Jimmy touched the brim of an imaginary cowboy hat in a much obliged gesture and winked. The barista turned away. On one of his elbows there was an inked Jesus head. Jimmy couldn't tell what was on the other. Something. Jimmy had to piss. He brought his coffee into the restroom with him and sat it on the sink. Above the urinal, a variety of things had been written. Jimmy read them while he pissed. To the left, someone had scrawled a Bible verse in pencil, something about a pale horse. Over to the right, some guy named Danny had professed his love for a girl named Debbie in magic marker. Danny and Debbie. It had a ring to it. Jimmy wondered if the two of them were still together. Danny hadn't added any updates that Jimmy could see. Maybe Debbie was pregnant. Maybe they got married and moved in with Debbie's invalid mother at the trailer park and were smoking a ton of dope and watching a lot of TV. Maybe it wasn't even Danny's baby. Jimmy zipped up, got his coffee, and purposely left the restroom without washing his hands. This time he sat down at a different table, just to be different. All three baristas were staring at him now. Their looks seemed to suggest he'd worn out his welcome. He got up and left, without so much as goodbye, leaving his free refill on the table. On his way home, Jimmy stopped at the supermarket to get a couple bags of nacho cheese Doritos. He liked to dunk them in his morning coffee, the way some behind-the-times folk did donuts. The store was crowded, with a lot of people that looked like they were ready to fight. Jimmy avoided them as much as possible. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer was playing over the intercom. Jimmy couldn't help but hum along. On his way out, he saw one of those kiosks where you can rent a movie for $1. He stood there for a while, looking at the selections, trying to decide what he might like to see. Some little kid was standing nearby. "What's a good movie?" Jimmy said to the kid. "Batman's good," the kid said. That figured. Jimmy inserted a credit card and punched in the numbers for Batman. A few lights blinked. Then a Batman DVD fell into the slot. He got the DVD out of the slot. The little kid was still there. "Say," Jimmy said, "you ever heard of Jesus?" Cocking his little head to the side, the kid gave Jimmy a "no duh" sort of look. "Sure, he's the guy that wrote the Bible." "Okay. And have you ever heard of the star of Batman?" "Sure," the little kid said, giving Jimmy another "no duh" look. "But I don't remember his name. He's been in lots of movies besides Batman. He's been in everything." When Jimmy got outside, the rain had turned to snow. The end.